Hi, everyone, and welcome to Forest Health 101, where we discuss everything forest health. I'm your host, Demian, and today we're talking to Chris Marais about insect identification and AI. Chris is a graduate student with the University of Florida, and he is focusing on data science and machine learning. So let's jump right into it. Chris Marais, welcome, PhD student at the University of Florida. Thanks for joining.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Very excited about this conversation. I've been really looking forward to this. And first of all, walk us a little bit through your journey. How did you actually get interested in this topic, in data science, in machine learning?
I have a bit of a weird backstory, I guess. Wasn't directly interested in machine learning and AI and stuff like that. Um, I always assumed that there's something that my brother would do. He's more the computational guy in our family. So I always thought, nah, computers, he'll do it. So I started off studying biology with majored in genetics, psychology, and physiology. And that was a nice foundation for human biology. Um, but I quickly realized that you can't really do biological analyses without computers. So did another degree in bioinformatics, and then in bioinformatics I got exposed to machine learning for the first time, and this was I think 2017. So I thought I really need to learn more about these things, so I switched over to a data science, did a master's in data science, but still applied techniques in a biological setting, which was tree genomics, pine tree genomics at the time. And then after that I moved over and worked for a big cat conservation company called Panthera for a year. And there it was more general software development type stuff. And then I ended up here last year doing another master's in forestry. And now I finally started my PhD, and I'm focusing more on like computational biology, which is a nice, I would say all of the projects that I'm involved with now is a little part of everything I've done before. So a little bit of genomics and a little bit of software development and a little bit of machine learning. So
that's awesome. Yeah, it's great to actually have a background on that. I think it's pretty unusual in the forest entomology, world to work in from these very different aspects in biology. And so I would like to start off by talking about AI, right? AI is basically everywhere today. We see predictive text, right? On every smartphone, we see language models all over the place. And when we're thinking about things like taxonomy or biodiversity, which is something that's absolutely related to your lab, image recognition is something that, folks are looking into, that you guys are looking into. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. But can you briefly explain what is AI and what are some of the benefits and the controversy behind it, right?
well, that's a tricky one. It's not really a nice question to answer, to be honest. AI is a very, because it stands for artificial intelligence, right? And those two words by themselves are extremely vague, because when you need to, as a biologist, I'm sure you've known, describing what is artificial is quite complicated by itself, and explaining intelligence is also a philosophical question that I don't think we have the answer to. So there are multiple answers to this question, and there is a more philosophical answer to this question, to which I think I can refer to Plato.Stanford. They have a nice explanation here that I have open actually. They describe AI as more by the goals of AI, and they have different. They say some systems are reason-based and some are behavior-based. And the goal of AI might be to simulate either rationality or simulate humans. So that refers to how we view intelligence. Is it true rationality or is it simulating just humanity? But I'll leave that rabbit hole for someone else to go down in. It's
Yeah, for
very
real.
deep and like a whole field in itself. I think more generally when people refer to AI, they want the answer of what does it mean practically. And I think these days we refer to AI more specifically machine learning, which is a subfield of AI. And even more specifically than that, we like referring to AI when it has to do with deep learning models, similar to the ones in ChatGPT or DALL-E or whatever. As for shortcomings and benefits, this is also a complicated one. I think there are obvious, very practical benefits of AI systems these days. We have, I mean, everybody, and if you're not using a large language model in your daily life, I can highly recommend it. It's very helpful. Recommender systems are things that we've been using all these times unknowingly. But that also touches on like the drawbacks of these machines. Specifically, the recommender systems touch on a sensitive topic, which is what is it? Social media. So they
Yeah.
recommend things to people, and that is very dependent on the objective function of the algorithm, which basically means when does the algorithm learn that something is good? And in those cases, that function can be a little bit warped because in the example of what is it, social media, it was to hold someone's attention, and we then only afterwards learned that these machines learned that holding someone's attention through anger or angry text or angry discourse online is quite
Yeah.
effective, and
Absolutely.
so it learns a function that doesn't really benefit humanity that well. So we become very angry human beings on Facebook. So that's one of the drawbacks. But I don't want to focus on that too much because I do think that we can solve that problem easily by thinking through the design more.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that as well these days with things happening at like even now with the recent disruptions at OpenAI seems to be coming from the same direction where people were driven by making moral decisions and thinking through the process before releasing an algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
So I like seeing that. But I'd say another drawback of modern AI systems more on a technical side is that uh, the scalability. Um, Models just tend to get bigger and bigger. I think in the beginning, when the first model was built to distinguish between different numbers on computer screen, it was quite small, and anybody could use it on their computer. But these days, these large language models, I think to just run, not even train, but just to run GPT-4, which is what ChatGPT is
Mm-hmm.
built on, you need something like 4 graphics cards, each costing $100,000 or whatever. I don't know, some
Yeah.
high
Yeah.
price. It's like extremely expensive. It's almost impossible to just run this thing at home. Um, so that's definitely like a drawback, and it seems to be that the technology or the algorithms have slowed down a little bit in how they've. I don't want to say that too much. I'll step on toes if I say that, but um, there's definitely a focus rather on scaling up networks, making them bigger and bigger and bigger, and giving them more data. They're extremely data hungry. I think that's a definite drawback, is that we're leaning on data a little bit too much, and it has given us some really cool things that have appeared, like these emergent properties that appear in some of the bigger models, where some of them learn new things that we didn't know they could
Mm-hmm.
learn just by giving them more data, like what we see with the language models. It seems like they have understanding of certain topics, or it's pseudo understanding at least, but it's the pseudo understanding is so good in certain cases that it can almost be interpreted as real understanding. And that's purely because it's been bombarded with so much data. But I think that's a drawback still, because we don't know when we're going to reach the limit of our of like what data can carry. It's like an empirical shortcoming.
Yeah.
Like the
And how
modern
these?
models don't have, yeah,
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
modern models don't have a priori capabilities. They don't have common sense. They don't have reasoning capabilities. Maybe after what's happened last week with OpenAI, we'll see something, but but they don't really have reasoning capability, and
Yeah, and I mean
that's definitely something that could be
there are
improved.
some limitations, right? When you ask these different models different things, depending on even like what topic you are or what you're asking, results can be trusted differently, right? If you ask for code, they tend to be pretty specific and pretty accurate. If you ask for something that requires a lot of expertise in some specific field, then it's a different vibe, right? So, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that as well. So how this all of this applies to fields like taxonomy or biodiversity or forest health in general. What approaches have you seen, or what examples have you seen that kind of like takes all of this information or this approach to address a specific problem? And of course, you can also introduce what you guys have been working on.
So a taxonomy, right, in my mind is two main things. I'm not a taxonomist, so this definition might be totally warped, and anybody can call me out on it. But to me, it seems that taxonomy is mostly concerned with classifying organisms in different groups, but also understanding the relationships between groups, a little bit of like the ecological system of those organisms. And the first part of it, the classifying organisms in different groups, is something that machine learning at least is notoriously really good at. It is something that is almost shown to be better at than humans with enough data. So I think there's room for that in the taxonomist's world, where the classification problem is kind of solved. It's like we have machines to automate that process, and I think we should open our minds and just use that tool to do that. And I think what often goes missing, I think, because that role is so big and that it's a large portion of what it means to be a taxonomist in my mind. I think a lot of people miss the the other role of a taxonomist, which is describing the interactions and relationships and truly understanding the biology of the systems that the organisms find themselves in. Because classification, right, is a very like low level information
Mm-hmm.
description. Uh, there is more to that, and that usually comes through people like Andrew that like really understands the organisms in an intuitive way, and then his job is deciphering his own mind and then writing papers about that. But then a lot of his time gets wasted on just identifying little creatures for people. So the role that AI can play here is alleviating that time sink for people like that, so they can focus on truly understanding. That's at least what I think.
Yeah, and a little disclaimer: I used to be a PhD student at the same lab that you are in, and you're talking about Andrew Johnson. Andrew is one of the best bark beetle taxonomists that exists, and without a doubt. But yeah, and that's kind of like I imagine a lot of the inspiration to build what you guys this prototype that you guys been working on came from, right? All this problematic that you're describing somehow. Talk us a little bit about this prototype or this what you guys call the bark beetle classifier.
Yeah, right. So we built a little prototype last year, a quick 6 month sprint. We built a little model that classifies bark beetles, and um, the idea was to help people like Andrew uh, identify the bulk of the beetles that he sees, because people send him samples from all over the place, and then he needs to identify them, making sure that we don't identify that there are not invasive species or things like that. Um, yeah, so we built a little classifier that identifies little bark beetles. I guess how that came about was I was initially employed to work on databases and things like that, and then I told you that this this seems like something that I would really like to do. Like, this is a problem that we could easily solve if we took a bunch of pictures. We're sitting on the
Mm-hmm.
world's biggest, um, I don't know, a database or but like a sample
Yeah,
set of bark
collection.
beetles. Collection, that's the right word. A collection of bark beetles. Why not just photograph, like take pictures of them and make photographs and build a model? And Yuri being that he's my PI and he was yours as well, but him being the guy that he is, he quickly moved me over to that project, and then um, we got a lab intern, Isabel, and she started taking a lot of pictures of bark beetles. Um, and I think it's kind of important to know why did we build a model for bark beetles? Because I know like iNaturalist exists. Why doesn't
Hmm.
iNaturalist just why don't we just use iNaturalist? Because it's so much easier. And the big problem with bark beetles is that they're so small. They're just too small to like take pictures of with a phone. So um,
Yeah, and a small parenthesis here, right? For those of you who may be listening that are not super familiarized with the group, uh, we're talking about bark and ambrosia beetles. These are one of the most significant, forest health issues and forest pests, both because some native species have been causing massive amount of damage in many regions of the world due to things like changing climate and management, but also in terms of invasive species, right? These are very tiny beetles that move around inside wood. Some of them very significant pests. You might have heard about laurel wilt. You might have heard about the short-haired borers, Ewelacea species. All of these are basically bark and ambrosia beetles, super tiny beetles, and exactly what you're describing, right? Taking a picture with a phone, even if you see a dead tree and you see them walking around, it's not that simple to identify them, right?
yeah, they're tiny. They're less than the size of a grain of rice. And I'm amazed. Somebody like Andrew, who's an absolute expert, like the expert in this field, could identify them by just holding them in his hand. But this is so rare and so hard. Like there are only like a handful of people that can do that in this
Oh,
world.
absolutely, absolutely. I used to ask him this question all the time, and he will describe things about how fast they actually move in your hand, or even he will basically say it just like looks right,
Yeah.
and I think that's the idea about these like images as well, right? Like how this actually is gonna work. So yeah, keep going with the prototype.
Yeah, so Andrew has this deep intuition of how to identify these beetles, and it's really hard to capture that in a machine because
Yeah,
when you have conversations with someone with that type of knowledge, I think it's almost hard for Andrew to also describe what he knows. He can say something like, yeah, the size really matters, or how they move matters, or how they fly matters, but he doesn't really know. He just knows that this is the beetle, and he's mostly correct. Send it for sequencing, we double check him. Andrew's right. So, so we thought about building this machine, and we called it Andrew Alpha as like a little joke. It's our first little prototype. Um, and the idea was to stick just to images. Let's not consider all these other things because where you catch the beetle and what the environmental
absolutely.
factors are also play a role, but that's just too much information to capture reliably. So um, we just took pictures of little beetles in a petri dish. And honestly, if anybody wants to take pictures and copy this system and send us images, go ahead. We love to just increase this database because the larger the database, the better the model becomes. But we take a little petri dish and we filled it with ethanol. We placed a bunch of beetles there and separate them a little bit so they don't touch each other. And then we take a picture of them. And
Gotcha.
then we label that image and send it and train the model. And I'll speak a little bit about how the model actually works and how we train it, or the current one. But so yeah, let me first think. So we use the model that we use is not too dissimilar to the technology that is used in ChatGPT
Hmm.
and DALL-E. I think most people that are familiar with machine learning know about convolutional neural networks. They're just a certain type of architecture for deep learning models,
Okay.
and um, they've been used in computer vision for years now and very effectively. Um, and then also transformers, which are more recently popularized through language models. These are both architectures that people use to make assumptions about the data is ingested by the model to make the training and the classification or inference process easier. And we use a combination of both of these. So we used a model called MaxVIT, which focuses it uses the convolutional neural network component to focus on small little pieces of the image, almost
Hmm.
like building a puzzle. If you're building a puzzle, and you can imagine that this part of the model looks at each puzzle piece individually and describes what's going on in there. And then we also use the transformer component, and that gives more of a global perspective of the image. That's almost like looking at the box of the puzzle and saying, "Oh, this is a big cat or whatever that you're building a puzzle out of." So using very focused and global attention, they call it, to describe what is in the image more accurately.
So basically, that means that you were describing you put all of these insects on a petri dish, right? Which is I kind of like that speaks also to the usability, right? Because these are going to be used for, like you were saying, samples that are being sent, but also monitoring. These insects are being used in surveillance and monitoring programs all over the world all the time, right? So people run into these. This is actually a practical problem that identifiers run into all the time. This is one of the most interesting groups of insects to actually do this. But what you were saying, does that basically mean that on one hand, you're looking at the overall shape of the insect, but also looking a little bit more in details of what the antenna looks like, what the elytron looks like, things like that? Or it's more about still the general shape of what you're seeing on the petri dish?
So we don't really know what the machine's looking at entirely, which is part of the black box idea behind it. We can get clues on testing it a little bit, but it's mostly shape. We're not focusing on and patterns and things like that. We're not focusing yet on high resolution things, because to digest each image, it breaks it down and compresses it quite a lot.
Gotcha.
That's a whole technical reason for that in the background, but it doesn't use the high resolution that we necessarily take the pictures with, all of it. Another important thing is that our model is capable of identifying a bunch of different beetles on one dish. That was one of the big aims that we wanted to have, is like we want a system where you have a camera and you just look at a bunch of beetles on a plate, and it classifies all of them at once. And it does this by cutting up the image into smaller little images and then sending each smaller little image of just one beetle to the classifier, and then the classifier classifies it. That cutting up part is also another machine learning model, which is a whole another can of worms that can be optimized in its own way, and a rabbit hole that you can go down. But it's something that people have done before, and you can just use what other people have done before.
So you selected, a bunch of species, which with you train this model, and then you basically send these images, basically chop the images on the petri dish, send this to the classifier, and it gives you an answer. So without speaking specifically on what species you use, because I imagine there were quite a few, but what was the rationale behind selecting this species for training the model? Is this, common basic species? Are these just because they represent completely different shapes in the bark beetle world? And I know people will say, they look at them and they will say, oh, they all look the same, but they actually don't. But different maybe tribes or what was the rationale behind it?
So there is this concept in machine learning that you train something first on the most. If you want to distinguish between different horse breeds, you first train a machine on how to distinguish between zebras, donkeys, and horses, and then from there you train on how different horse breeds and then different colors and things like that.
Okay.
Almost like refining as you go along.
Gotcha.
And we're taking a similar approach to this, where our first initial model contained a bunch of different beetles that do look quite dissimilar if you look at them. I mean, to me, as someone that doesn't study these beetles too in depth, they do look very similar. Like, to me, they all look like little brown pellets. But when I reviewed the data, I could see there were differences, so I was able to distinguish them. Initially, we trained them on 12 different species, and they were all selected based on how popular they are in Florida, which is where we are.
Gotcha.
So we almost thought about it as a distribution of, if 5 species occupy 90% of all the beetles that you'll see, we need to at least include these 5 species. So, and then we saved the rare species for later, because we also don't always have images of those or samples of them and things like that. So we selected them based on that. Now we've entered the next phase of collecting data, And we're taking, at the moment, taking pictures of beetles that specifically look very similar. So we're trying to
Mm.
push the model to its limit and see where does it fall apart, where does it struggle to identify or distinguish different species from one another. And I think we're already past 20 different species. We're aiming to add at least 100 more
Awesome.
within the next coming year to train the model a little bit. But maybe to add on top of just the technical part of the model training is that we chop up these images and we send it to the model and we train it with that. But the training framework that we use, we need those images to have labels with them at the moment to say that we know what this beetle is and what species it is. But for the next step that we're building, we don't necessarily need that. I'm trying to
Mm.
expand this model to work on unlabeled images as well to enhance classification. And that's with simple, if you want to look into it, self-supervised learning and things like that. Um, that was one thing that we want to expand on because the big role of the model. I think what we really want to use this for is we want we want to be able to take pictures of a large group of beetles and classify them into their different species. But then we want to identify those rare species that are really problems because
Mm.
most bark beetles are not pests.
Yep.
That's something that I had to learn. And the word pest is a touchy topic and touchy term. But most bark beetles are not pests. But you do get ones that are extremely damaging that could eviscerate whole industries. And we want to identify those early on. So we're working with the EDRR, or Early
Mm-hmm.
Detection and Rapid Response teams to identify these rare beetles. But that means that these are also rare species to take pictures of. So we can't train a model to be good at identifying those just from experience alone. So we need to come up with other little workarounds to identify rare species.
Is this because of availability of samples, or just because they're not the bulk of the data that the model is getting?
Availability of samples and it's not the bulk. Because of that, it's not the bulk of the data that the model is getting. And so we don't want to also train this model on less data and then like only select the rare species, because we also
Mm-hmm.
want it to be good at identifying the ones that are well known. Because if it's good at identifying the well-known beetles, we can make sure that we put them away. So in the meantime, I came up with my own little algorithm to calculate whether a beetle is known or unknown. So we're
Okay.
pretty sure about some 10 beetle species that are really well known. And if it's not one of those, we call it unknown. And then we give it a little probability and say, okay, it's 80% unknown. You need to investigate this further and call someone maybe about this. But we're trying to get away from that because that's a little bit hard coded. And really train a model on less data. Currently, our model is really good at digesting new species. We need something small like 10 pictures of say 10 different beetles to
Okay.
train a new species, which is very little. So
Mm-hmm.
if you take one picture of a petri dish of species and send us that, we can train a new species. So we can ramp it up rapidly. We're not doing that. We're taking like hundreds of pictures of beetles per species to make sure that it's really got every angle of every little bunch of different individuals and captures the variety within a species as well.
I was wondering what you were saying about the how the pictures are used. What about 3D pictures, like 3D images that kind of like capture the same beetle but from very different angles? And is that something that you guys are looking into implementing, or this is kind of completely different stage that will be very hard at this point?
So we've looked at that, and so one problem with the petri dish technique is that when you have a bunch of beetles in ethanol, a bunch of them
Mm-hmm.
go lie on their backs and they just chill on their backs, and you photograph their undersides. And the opposite is true if you take pictures of beetles that are pinned to little boards. They're always
Exactly.
with their backs facing
Yeah.
upwards. So those pictures never are never the same. So it's hard to we have to include both of those pictures. So I'm trying to include more pinned pictures as well. But that's a bit tricky because there's
There you
not a
go.
lot of pictures like that. So we have in our we're a very weird lab, I realized, because we have a film student and a who's also a historian, and we have a microbiologist, and we have some foresters and some everybody's doing something different. The intern or she's now just a scientist in our lab that takes the pictures. She has a background in art and mathematics, which is so strange combinations of things. But the film student in our lab, Ben, he's taking a class of doing 3D scans of beetles, and
Okay.
they've scanned a few species already where they and this is amazing, where they go down to a nano scale. You can see every little ridge and pore and hair on the beetle's surface. But the idea is for him to then use those 3D models, and then we can twist it and turn it and make a little, almost like make a little virtual puppet out of it,
Mm-hmm.
and then take a bunch of pictures of that beetle, and then feed that into the neural network to train it. So yes, we're looking at using 3D models, but it's extremely expensive. Like running those
Mm.
machines is obviously quite expensive. So we save that for the really rare beetle species. Or
Gotcha.
the aim is to save that for the real rare beetle species where we only have one or two samples of. And we also need to
Yeah.
make sure that it works, that like
Yeah.
the 3D images are not that different from the real images. And that's quite hard by itself.
Yeah, and that kind of like takes me to my next point too, which is the importance of data and insect collections for this type of work, right? There's a big part that is, training a model and making sure that what we're seeing, what we're classifying is actually accurate. And a lot of that has to do with what you feed the model with, right? So what is the role of right now with data insect collections and the availability of these?
So that touches on what I said earlier, right? About
Mm-hmm.
how modern models are extremely data heavy. Even this one where we say we can use 10 pictures of a beetle to digest, but we still need 10 pictures of beetle.
Yeah.
You could technically, if you would want a machine to be able to run on just one image or even no images, which is
Mm-hmm.
also part of what I'll be working on in the coming semester, is training a model that works with zero images. But that's that's a whole other can of worms, and I won't open that now. But um, data is extremely important. I think the only reason why our lab is in such a really good position to have built this model is because of the collection that we're sitting on. We have the beetles in vials, and we have someone like Andrew to help us identify them and teach us how he thinks about identifying beetles, and we can instill that in the model and kind of give it some more information. It's absolutely essential. I, as much as the technical people and me included, like the computer scientists, love the fancy algorithms and things like that, we're still working towards what I said earlier is like machines that have a priori knowledge. We still rely on mostly on models that are empirically driven. Like they need a lot of data,
Yeah.
so it's essential.
But also the importance of people, right? Taxonomists, identifiers, that expertise. I feel like, particularly at this stage, is going to be absolutely critical to make the decisions on how to build this thing, right? But also, how do you think that is going to play out in terms of moving forward, right? When you think about this kind of like prototype or this type of approach in the next couple decades, what do you imagine with something like this, and what do you imagine the role of taxonomies, classifiers, people is going to play or is going to be in that process?
So that,
Very philosophical question too, I know, but
yeah, no, I mean, and this is a question that we need to address quickly because I mean we're
it's happening.
these
Yeah.
aren't this is not unique to just our field. This is a question for
Hmm.
every field. I think what makes it nice is that we can add some more specific context to it to the taxonomists, but there's a massive fear of we're we're finding such value in someone like Andrew to describe to us what he thinks, how he thinks about classifying beetles, even though it takes him time to process that himself and figure it out himself. Um, but training someone like that in a world where you have automated classifiers is not going to happen. Like if you have a machine to classify you a bunch of things, why would you invest money in training someone like Andrew to spend hours looking at beetles? And we want to avoid that situation. We need those people because without people like that, you can't build models like this.
Exactly.
That is the knowledge that there's a reason why we're calling it Andrew Alpha. It's like a small little subset of what Andrew's mind does. I think the role of the taxonomist has to change, though. I think most people that I speak to either see machine learning as a massive threat and do away with it through avoidance, or they think that it is not a threat at all and that there is some magic behind human intelligence. I don't think there's a lot of magic behind human intelligence. I do think that it's just a matter of time before we can simulate it accurately enough where it becomes irrelevant whether there's magic or not. So I think, and I don't think avoidance is the best strategy. I think we need to I like uncomfortable topics.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think it's more people should embrace the uncomfortable topic of what do we do now. And Yuri and Andrew and I, well, mostly Yuri, but we have these conversations in our lab all the time. But Yuri helped us write a little paper and about this is the role of taxonomists in the future of AI-driven world. And we basically concluded that coming back to maybe my little description of what I think taxonomists are, but they need to describe the interactions between organisms and more understanding the biology. We don't have true understanding in models yet. So the role that taxonomists can fill in the immediate future, 5-10 years, is understanding. Build your understanding. Menial tasks like classification we can start replacing already. But we need to keep adapting. And I mean, we're in the world of evolution where we all study evolution in some way. So we need to embrace that as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a great point. So where do you see this, model? I mean, this is being used for biodiversity classification and of course it's going to be implemented for many different uses that we kind of touch on a little bit. Where do you see this kind of approach being used as well? Maybe not in taxonomy, but when you think about image recognition in scientific research, you were mentioning things like ecology or maybe systematics as well, but this more kind of like image recognition. Do you see this being taken to being implemented in something else as well, or where do you see this going?
I think the little subfields of computer vision and language processing in machine learning in science specifically will merge a little bit more. There's a big drive in the moment to build what they call multimodal models, which is basically models that are able to interpret language and images together. A great example of that would be a model called CLIP. And this is just it almost ingests language and images in the same way. It's a very technical background on how you can explain it, and somebody, if you're interested in that, go look it up and read the paper. It's wonderful. But I think it's all about digesting information, right? And it's scary, but that's like the biggest role of a scientist, is to digest information at this point. We need to think of what are the other roles of scientists, and I think similar to the previous question, part of that is to this is something that Yuri and I talk about a lot as well, and it's part of like the interaction between these complex computer vision models, whatever, and scientists, is translating the models to the general public. And that, I think, that is a great direction to focus on, is how to really take the information, because they have theirs. It's almost like just like how Andrew needs to sit down and translate what he's thinking to write the paper and publish it. Like, how does Andrew classify organisms and how does he understand the biology? He needs to sit down and think and translate. So he's practiced at that already. He's already learned how to do that with his own mind. And now he does it with a model that's much simpler than his own mind. Oh, so much easier. So you can keep the same skills and apply it in a different way. So that's more of an answer to the previous question. If you want to know where I think this is going, computer vision models, I think it's going more in the route of just merging different data sets together. You see more and more where people are pushing, like I said, this multimodal thing, converting data to a more universally digestive way. So the whole idea why transformers work on images and on text is because of the way in which we present the information to the model. And I think we're doing that with more and more different kinds of information. We're doing that with brain data, and we're doing that with images, and we're doing that with all kinds of little sensors and things. So it's all going in that direction.
Yeah, that's a great point. So just to kind of like wrap up, I wanted to ask you where can people maybe learn more about your work, the work you guys are doing, and maybe providing even like images that you were saying that these things are hungry for data and images. So is there anything that people that are working with these organisms every day can provide?
So we have our lab website, ambrosiasymbiosis.org. It's currently in the process of being reworked and redone, but it should be finished in like a week or two, probably when this comes out, I'm sure. But everybody's contact information is there, mine and Yuri, my PIs. So yeah, contact us through there. If you are interested in taking pictures of these little beetles, and if you're interested in applying this model, email us.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm going to leave all the information in the description below, so all the links that you were mentioning and maybe some others that people could actually use. Chris, I appreciate this conversation. Was really good. Awesome, awesome topics, and I think that this is something pretty unusual in the forest health world, and I feel like super interesting. So thanks a lot for joining.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you for joining to this discussion with Chris, talking about insect identification and AI. Hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you want to support the podcast, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. As always, have an awesome week and see you in the next one.